You're hiking in the mountains. It's beautiful, it's serene, and it's peaceful. It's nighttime, and you've been made aware that bears are out. Be careful of the brown bear. As you lay down in your tent, and you get ready for the evening, you hear some rustling in the bushes. It's definitely not a raccoon, and you're sure it's not a field mouse. And then it dawns on you, oh my God, what if it's a bear? You hear a few snorts and a growl, and there it is, it's a bear. What do? Do you run? Do you fight? Do you stand your ground? And when you look through the zipper part of your tent, you realize that the bear's sobbing. It's crying, it's upset. Well, that's not really bear. That's not what bears do. Well, maybe you've never met a bear like this before. On this week's episode of the Silver Fox Journal podcast, I want to introduce you to someone that's special. Like me and like many others you may or may not know. The brown bipolar bear. Are you ready? Let's go. Hi, everybody. My name is Elle, and I'm bipolar. Bam, I said it. I was diagnosed bipolar in my very early 20s. I want to say I was around 21, 22. And I had a little bit of understanding of it because my father is bipolar as well. And over the years, I have discovered there are so many misnomers and people who don't understand what having bipolar disorder is. They don't know what it looks like. And what they do see is what's either shown on TV or misused. And one of my biggest pet peeves, sometimes it rubs me the wrong way, but thanks to all the therapy I've had and being able to address my bipolar disorder and how to live with it and live around other people, I try to take moments when I hear people use phrases like, oh my God, she's just the worst, she's bipolar. Or when she threw the dish at me, she was acting all bipolar. It's deeper than that. And so this episode, I know most of my stories are, personal stories and I can give you information, but I do want to provide a little more data other than just hearing my mouth run. And I expect that same thing will happen when I have guests on the show as well. But my biggest thing is let's define what bipolar disorder really is. Now, according to the National Institute of Mental Health, years ago, they referred to it as manic depression. Some people still do, but when you look in the DSM, it's considered bipolar. There are different types of bipolar. But bipolar is a brain disorder, and according to this, I'm quoting it, a brain disorder that causes unusual shifts in mood, energy, activity level, and the ability to carry out day-to-day tasks. There are 4 different types, and the way they're classified is you have bipolar 1. Bipolar 1 is usually the one that people quote, say, oh, she's bipolar, he's going bipolar. This is the ones where you have higher manic episodes. These are the episodes where you feel delusions of grandeur. You have a lot of energy. You're bouncing off the walls, very little to no sleep. Your discretion is sometimes inhibited. And these can last for weeks or months. Bipolar 2, which has a pattern of depressive episodes, you still have something called hypomania, where you mix between the manic and the depression. And those can last for weeks and months as well. Something called cyclothic. Oh, am I saying that wrong? Forgive me. Cyclothymania. CYCLOTHYMIC. So forgive me for pronouncing it wrong because I'm reading and podcasting at the same time. I can pat my head and scratch my belly too. This is defined as having hypomanic symptoms, which I explained earlier, and depressive symptoms lasting for at least 2 years. And then something also called not other specified. Now, I don't know if you're a medical nerd like I am, I've learned that NOS, which is not other specified, is a way that basically says that a person has some type of illness or needs to be diagnosed with something and placed in a category, but they don't actually fit in a specific category. But they recognize that some of their symptoms and traits are indicative of having that particular illness. Well, that's the same thing for mental illness as well. So you have those four. I myself am bipolar 2. For many years, I was diagnosed as NOS, not other specified, because I had a lot of those traits. And some of them matched bipolar 1, some of them matched bipolar 2. But it wasn't until, I'd say maybe, I was in my late 20s when I actually got diagnosed specifically as bipolar 2. The definition part is to actually clear that misunderstanding up. So from a person who is bipolar to anyone else who wants to use the phrase, oh my God, he's acting bipolar. Well, you know, her bipolar, boop, or whatever. Don't say it unless you know what it really means. It breeds ignorance, and it also forces people into using terms and terminology that are incorrect. Some people aren't as vocal about mental illness as I am and maybe other people. So when you start putting people in positions by using phrases like that, you're not helping the situation at all. Because I can assure you, not everyone, quote, acts bipolar. I mean, what does that look like? I mean, bipolar is different for different people. So that's the biggest thing. Making sure that you understand that it is a depressive disorder. It's a manic disorder that happens in a person. There is research that shows that there is some genetic link. There are also triggers that happen. It could be drug use. It could be trauma. Everyone is different. But at some point in their life, if the person is predisposed to having bipolar disorder, something will trigger that to happen. The reason why I call this episode The Brown Bipolar Bear is I myself am brown. I'm an African American. I identify with my culture and my ethnicity, as many people do. And some people would say, well, what does that have to do with mental illness? Well, it actually has quite a bit to do with mental illness. One of the biggest concerns for people of color is that they may not get the care that they need. And so a lot of mental illness, especially bipolar disorder from Black and brown people, are heavily underrepresented and they're underreported. And so I went to this other website. Let me try to find it. I don't normally do this because I try to go off the cuff. But, you know, considering there's almost maybe even more now because these statistics might be off, but there's over 2.4 million Americans that are diagnosed with bipolar in some capacity. And one of the biggest risk factors for Black and brown people in our country, in the United States, and I know I have listeners in other countries, but I'm sure it's very similar. There are certain things that stop Black and brown people from getting mental health care. Mistrust of healthcare professionals. There are historical rates of having higher than average institutionalizations for African Americans with mental illness. And so people will tell stories. Well, you remember what happened to Joey? Or you remember what happened to whoever when they went to the hospital and they never came home, those kind of things. There's also cultural barriers, religious barriers. I know I've heard from different support groups that I've been in and actually facilitated. I've heard people say, well, the pastor said they were just going to pray the demon away. Or we went to a retreat trying to fix me. You know, I mean, so there's certain cultural and religious barriers. There's also socioeconomic factors. Now, this is not to say that people who are not Black and brown don't have socioeconomic background issues that stop them from being able to get appropriate mental health. But according to this website, mentalhealthamerica.net, that does have some research information on it, it says about 25% of African Americans don't have health insurance. And I can tell you right now, I can even tell you from a psychiatrist bill that I just got in the mail with insurance, that some insurance companies don't pay for certain diagnostic testing, which is odd to me because I've been bipolar for over 20 years. But when I saw this new physician, there's a fee. It was like a $250 fee of like a administrative slash. Anyway, my insurance should cover it, and it didn't. So that's one big thing. Finances or something. And that also is indicative in other cultures, Native American and Asian, especially Asian American individuals who are needing mental health care or have bipolar disorder underreport. So that also skews data about how to treat people, medications that work, because if you don't have a good cross-reference or a good cross-group for people to test you to see what it's like in a certain community to have bipolar disorder, you're not going to get the data you need. Something that's that's been known and misconstrued, especially when it comes down to domestic violence, also suicide, and other like drug abuse, drug misuse. I was reading another article through the National Library of Medicine and National Institutes of Health. They did a study over, I believe it's like an 8 to 10 year period of people who have bipolar 1 and 2 disorder. And they discovered that over 24 different reports, when they used, if I'm not mistaken, according to this data, they used, I want to say over 2,000 people. And don't quote me 100% because I'm kind of skimming through so many different research. But what they said is that between 25 and 60% of individuals with bipolar disorder will have attempted suicide at least once in their life, whereas 4 to 19% will complete it. Now, that's just a blanket cross study of 24 different reports. Now, this doesn't specify Black people or Asian people or Native American. It doesn't break that down. It just says that this group of people, almost at a close to 20% rate, once they've attempted actually complete suicide. That doesn't mean that all bipolar people are suicidal. But again, all of this is connected. The underreporting, the socioeconomic issues, any type of barrier that's going to stop people from getting the mental health that they need also is a barrier that allows researchers and clinicians and social workers and therapists and people who do support groups from getting the raw data that they need to make sure that they educate the community. So what does bipolar disorder feel like? Well, it's different for different people. But for this brown bipolar bear, I'll tell you, as someone who has bipolar 2, my concern is more depression. So I do have periods of mania, but I've also been very well, I've had quite a bit. I joke to a lot of people when I talk about my bipolar disorder, but I can say I have had hundreds of hours of therapy over the years. I mean, from the first time I went to therapists thinking I didn't need them, back and forth to maintaining and going through intensive therapy, going through something called the EMDR, which is a way of dealing with trauma. And I had over the years, I've had some great therapists and doctors, and then I've had some not so great therapists and doctors. But there's this one therapist who, as she liked to call herself, was a conduit. She helped me change my life. And I went through some intensive therapy when I was living in Florida, and her name was Julie, and Julie was awesome. And if I ever win the lottery and when I become independently wealthy, wherever she is, I will make sure that her resources will be funded, because I know that she touched my lives, and I'm sure she's touched the lives of many other people. But going through those years of therapy, I was able to learn different cognitive behavioral techniques, meditation, prayer, ways to deal with coping with my mental illness. Mania is exhilarating. It feels like a roller coaster ride that is the highs. It's very little sleep. It's starting projects and having them all over the house. You're painting one room with your right arm while you are writing a manuscript with your left foot, and you're cooking a 5-course meal with your left arm, and you're talking on the phone, and the vacuum cleaner's out, and 2 TVs are on, and the water's running in the tub, and guess what? You can handle all of it. That's what mania feels like. Mania also feels like, woo, I tell you what, I can do anything. I can create anything. I can go anywhere. I can meet anybody. You can talk a mile a minute. Now, does anyone who talks a mile a minute and bounce all off the walls, does that mean they're bipolar? No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying from the viewpoint of a person who is bipolar, that's what it feels like. It sounds weird to hear this, but I know that I have gone 24, 36, 32 hours and just not slept and been like, oh, I'm good. And physiologically, my body will tell me, whoa, shut down. But my brain is like, oh, you don't need to shut down. Just keep going. What does the depression feel like? Depression, I don't know if you've ever remembered this commercial. I think it was for Cymbalta. I don't remember what drug it was. But there was a prescription medication, and they were saying depression hurts. Depression actually really does hurt. You feel a void. It's blank. It's dark sometimes. And I've heard from other people who are bipolar or suffer seasonal depression or just depression in general. There's a threshold that you have that you may or may not meet, and it's hard to explain it. But I know for me, my threshold is when I recognize that I really don't care about much. And sometimes it's seen as being flippant and disconnected and kind of rude. But at that point, when I'm in a low, I really don't care what you're talking about. And I'm one of the most kind, caring people you ever. I love listening. This is why I'm on a podcast now with a microphone telling everyone all of my business. I like to share, but I'm sharing to share so other people can identify. And I'm sure there's a lot of people who suffer from depression and bipolar who can identify with the fact that sometimes you just don't care. People want to say, well, I need you to get up and go to work. I can barely hold my head up off this pillow. You think I need to get in the car and drive right now? You don't want to wash. You don't want to brush your teeth. You don't want to cook. You don't want to do anything. And it makes it even harder when you have either a house partner or kids. I can only imagine. I don't have any children, but I can only imagine what it would feel like with having kids. Colors aren't as bright. Smells aren't as sweet. Things aren't as funny. You don't like a lot of the things that you normally, quote, normal. I hate using that word, normal and crazy and weird. I don't like using those words, but because they're all on a spectrum. Nothing really does it for you. Even down to your taste buds. Taste is different. And when you're in relationships, whether it's an intimate relationship or a platonic relationship, you may actually even find it hard to try to connect with someone because you just don't care. You don't care. I've never myself been directly hospitalized. I consider myself to be very fortunate. After watching my father suffer with his bipolar disorder and being hospitalized, I made a promise to myself that I would do whatever it took to make sure that I had the resources and the knowledge to be well. And I knew that as a bipolar person, that will change. It will seesaw. It will teeter-totter. But it's up to me to be responsible to my healing, and my healing is an everyday thing. There are times when I don't want to have a conversation. There are times when I just can't bear the sight of another human being. And then there's other times when I'm the life of the party and I want to be around as many people as I can. This brown bipolar bear wants to share with everyone else that being bipolar is not a death sentence. It's not a scarlet A. It's not any reason to make someone either feel less than or that they don't have the support that they should get because they need it. I mean, it is recognized as a disability through the Americans with Disabilities Act, but there's a certain level of fragility that comes with it that's questioned by a person's ability and their resilience. And being bipolar doesn't make you any less resilient than the next person. It just gives you a different testimony toward what that resilience came from. I would like everyone to know that as a bipolar person, had I not told you that, you probably wouldn't have known. And that's the reason why I share. I've noticed, any of you can attest to this, whether it's on social media or you're looking on the news. Children are committing and attempting suicide at higher rates. The LGBTQI+ community is having even higher rates of suicide. We also have to think about our men and women in uniform, whether they are wearing blue or fatigue, that also can suffer from depression and bipolar, and let's not forget PTSD. These are mental illnesses that affect people on a daily basis, and you don't have to have a scar or a missing limb or a fake eye to know that someone can be hurting on the inside and they need help. And so it's really a good opportunity to learn what you can. Be mindful of the words that you use. Extend yourself sometimes a little past your comfort zone if you see that someone needs help, because that conversation that you have with someone that day could be the difference between them deciding that they don't want to be here anymore or that they do. I share my story with the hope that other people can feel more comfortable with creating dialogue. This is just one woman's conversation with whoever's listening about mental health, but I can't stress enough, especially in communities of color and marginalized communities, the LGBTQI+, however you distinguish yourself, communities, that it's very important to discuss mental health and the support that people need in order to thrive. A couple of resources that I think would be good for people is NAMI, NAMI. That is a support group, a system that is, I believe NAMI is international, if I'm not mistaken, it is. And then there is DBS, it's called the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance. I actually used to be a member, and I used to facilitate a group in the community where I live for people who suffer from other illnesses, but mostly from depression and bipolar. And that was a very great opportunity for me. In my striving to maintain mental wellness, I discovered that I have the privilege of having had good health care at points in my life. Not always, because I didn't always have health care, and I definitely didn't have mental health, and I didn't always take my medicine. But I've had the opportunity of getting the care that I need and being fairly fortunate in the results of either treatment and or medicine that I took. And going through being a facilitator of the DBSA groups, I recognize that there's some people who really aren't well and who do need that support, and they don't get it. So my takeaway from today's episode, if you can, extend yourself when you need to, even if that's just taking the time to Google an article or speak to someone who mentions that they do have a depressive disorder or some type of mental illness, and saying, I want to know more. If you have any questions, you can Instagram me, the Silver Fox Journal, my Facebook page, even if you go to my blog, www.silverfoxjournal.com, and click on the contact, and you can send me a message in there. I don't have a problem sharing. I wish more people did. I'm in the hopes that the more we create a dialogue, the better our opportunity is at us, literally each one teaching one and making people feel more comfortable with their mental illness and supporting those who do have it. And this episode was a little longer than normal. I think it's important sometimes to get past that. It's got to be 15 minutes. But I knew that I wanted to speak about this. Is something that's very near and dear to me. And it is also something I think is important and needs to be discussed by everyone, because mental illness affects at least one person you know, whether it's the bus driver that takes your kids to school, or the organist at your church, or the guy that just made your burger at Burger King, or your best friend or your spouse. I mean, your cousin, your sister. It affects so many people, which means it affects you and it affects our community. So, again, as usual, I'd like to thank you for taking time out of your day. You could have spent that time anywhere else, listening to another television show or another podcast, but you did it and you listened with me, and I'm thankful. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Silver Fox Journal Podcast. Until then.